honored rabbis, and distinguished community members and friends. Thank you for joining us this evening for a virtual Yom Hashoah program. While we are not yet able to gather together physically, we are grateful for the technology that allows us to come together and to share this experience together. We will begin tonight's program with Tehillim recited by Alex Ernst and Zachary Newmark, Hafter Middle School students.
Shir Amalot, Mimamakim, Karatich Adonai. Adonai, Shima Bekoli, Tiana, Znecha, Kashuvola, Kol Tachanunai. Im Avonot, Tishmoria, Adonai, Miyamod. Kim Chaslicha, Leman, Tivarei. Kiviti Adonai, Kiftanachi, Livaro, Chalti. Nashi Adonai, Mishomrim Laboker, Shomrim Laboker. Yachal Yisrael Adonai, Kim Adonai Chesed, Verbei Mofedut. V'yivtet Yisrael Mikol Avonotav.
Shir Lamalot, Esai Nai Harim, Me'ayin Yavo Ezri. Ezri Me'im Adonai, Osei Shamayim Va'aretz. Al Yitei Lamor Raglecha, Al Yanum Shomrecha. Hine lo yanum belo yishan shomer Yisrael. Adonai shomrecha, Adonai tilcha yad yaminecha. Yomam hashemesh lo yakeka, ve'areach balayla. Adonai yishmarcha mikol ra, yishmor et nafshecha. Adonai yishmar tzecha vuecha, me'ata v'yad olam.
I would now like to introduce Rabbi Aryeh Leibowitz, Rabbi of Beis HaKnesses of North Woodmere, to share some inspiring words with us.
Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory points out that there's a phrase in our Torah that is true only in our religion and is not really accepted by the world religions. And that phrase is kedoshim tihiyu. Unlike all other religions, in the Jewish religion, kedoshim tihiyu, we believe that kedusha, that holiness, is not only reserved for the select few, it's not only for the priest, it's not only for the clergy. That every single person can achieve kedusha, can achieve holiness. And in fact, when we refer to those who were victims of the Holocaust, all kinds of Jews, from all kinds of backgrounds, from all levels of religious observance, we refer to all of them as kedoshim. There's a beautiful story I once read about Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. A fellow by the name of Dr. Hirschkopf was a young teenager visiting his aunt and uncle up in the Catskill Mountains. And his uncle was a doctor, and his aunt told him, you know, the great Rav Moshe Feinstein is coming to your uncle's office tomorrow. And he was all excited. Here was a young boy, a 14, 15-year-old boy, learning in Rav Moshe Tendler Shir in Yeshiva University in MTA. And the great Rav Moshe Feinstein was coming to the office. He went early, he got himself dressed up. He couldn't wait to greet Rav Moshe. His aunt and uncle were not religiously observant. They were Holocaust survivors. And Rav Moshe Feinstein came in and he watched in horror as his aunt went over to Rav Moshe Feinstein and said, Rav Moshe, so nice to see you, and gave him a peck on the cheek. And then his aunt disappeared into the back room. And this young teenager says to Rav Moshe, he doesn't know what to say. He says, you have to understand, she's not religious, she doesn't know. And Rav Moshe puts his arm on Dr. Hirschkopf's arm and he says, she is much holier than me and you. She has numbers on her arm. In the Jewish religion, we can all become kedoshim. All different levels of people became kedoshim. So what do we do in the aftermath of the Holocaust? What do we do in the aftermath of such a tragedy? Well, there's another part of the Torah that tells us that each day in the Beis HaMikdash, the first thing that they would do is something called Trumas Hadeshen. They would remove the ashes. When we've been left with a pile of ashes, when we've been left with destruction, that's where we start to build kedusha. That's where we start to build holiness. That's where the next day's work of building up our relationship with God begins. And we witnessed a generation of survivors who lived through the worst atrocities and then went and built. They built communities, they built synagogues, they built yeshivos. And they take such great pride in their life's accomplishments. And it's our job to carry that building forward. And I'll conclude with one more story. My grandfather, Shalita, should live and be well, is a Holocaust survivor. A survivor of Buchenwald, a survivor of Auschwitz. And he once told me that looking at our family, seeing generations, which Bli Ayin Hara is now able to see a fifth generation of religiously observant descendants. He said, I would do it again. I would go through everything again to be able to see the continuation of our tradition through my family. That kind of strength, that kind of power is something that is so uncommon in our generation. It's only through the generation of kedusha, the generation of the holiest people, that we've been able to build, and we take the responsibility to continue to build Judaism, more yeshivos, more shuls, and a greater connection with Hashem.
Honored rabbis, distinguished community members, neighbors, and friends. On behalf of my co-chairman, Nathaniel Rogoff, and the entire Yom HaShoah event committee, thank you for joining us this evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dana Frankel, but perhaps I should introduce myself as Sarah Breindel. For while that name is less known to others, it is that name that carries with it the legacy of 3 great-grandmothers, 2 of whom perished during the Holocaust and 1 who survived. Or perhaps I should introduce myself as the proud granddaughter of Lana and Abraham Lipner and Helen and Leo Kadowitz, those 4 heroes that survived the Holocaust and went on to build families in a new world. I stand before you tonight as their representative, their voice, for they are no longer here to share their stories. But I am also the mother of children who are named for Holocaust survivors and for a woman who rescued children from the Kindertransport in England. I share this with you because I think it explains what brings me here. Because I know in my mind, in my heart, and in my soul that I owe everything I have to the fearless and faithful family that came before me. I know I am not alone in this sentiment. I share it with many of you, those of us who are related to victims and survivors of the Shoah, and those that might not be biologically related, but who nonetheless have opened their minds and hearts to the survivors' stories. I think it is befitting that Yom HaShoah falls immediately after Pesach. The Haggadah gives us a clear directive to consider ourselves as slaves who were liberated from Egypt. When we sit at our seders, do we see ourselves that way? Do we taste the salt water and taste tears? Do we eat maror and recall the bitterness of our lives? Do we lean and recall the luxury of becoming free? For me, this directive is difficult to fulfill. To truly, genuinely put ourselves in the shoes of those who experience terrible challenges and then the miraculousness of redemption. This tragedy and this miracle that happened so very long ago, can we feel it? As we get farther and farther away from Yetziat Mitzrayim, gaining that perspective increases in difficulty. And that's why Yom HaShoah is so important. As we get farther away from the Holocaust, the harder it gets for the community as a whole to genuinely recall what happened. How many of us grew up with a Holocaust survivor at our Pesach Seders? How many of us had the honor and privilege to share a Seder with a Holocaust survivor this year? As we lose more and more survivors, the eyewitnesses to both the tragedies and the miracles, it gets more and more difficult. But it gets more and more important. Sadly, we have little security that in the 21st century, the days of religious discrimination are behind us. In the news, it is not uncommon to read about isolated attacks against Jewish people, a Hanukkah party stabbing, the murder of an elderly Jewish man in California, shootings in synagogues, the beating of a Jewish pregnant woman in London. Perhaps even more frightening and difficult to defend, the microaggressions, the anti-Semitic jokes and slurs and casual comments that are loaded with racism and discrimination. The Haggadah reassures us, V'hi she'amda lavotenu v'lanu, shelo echad bilvad, amad aleinu lechalotenu, ella shebachol dor vador, omdim aleinu lechalotenu v'hakadosh baruch hu matzilenu miadam. It is this covenant that has stood for our forefathers and for us. For not just one enemy has stood against us to wipe us out, but in every generation there have been those who have stood against us, and the Holy One, blessed be He, saves us from their hands. That is why nights like tonight are so important, because we, as members of Am Yisrael, are all children, grandchildren, cousins of survivors. We can't forget what they endured. We must take this opportunity to honor those that we have lost, to memorialize what we now know, to increase awareness among the younger generations, to ensure that this will never happen again. We are so grateful that Moshe Jacobs offered to share his story of survival with us tonight. We cannot take for granted the precious privilege it is for us to hear eyewitness testimony from survivors. Mr. Jacobs, please share your story with us.
I was born in Poland, in Słowiki, Poland, in 1922. This picture was taken before the war. I'm here. This is my mother. This is my brother, Itche. This is my brother, Yechiel. This is Papa, Roise, Shime, Yitel, Renye. Before the war, we had a bakery. And the name was Yosef Yakubovich, my father's name, and I myself was a helper to work in the bakery. The Nazis invaded Poland. They declared a law which was a Jewish person was not allowed to exist. And they did show the might of the destruction, how they were hanging young children, and we had been standing and watching how it was done. My oldest brother was Nathan, then I was Moshe, then was Itche, and then was Yechiel. Itche, who was killed in Ploshov concentration camp. And my father, they made him kneel down, and he was executed by Ukrainian army soldiers who were working for the Germans. And I escaped to a city of Krakow. And over in Krakow, I knew some Polacks who used to work for us in the bakery. And I went to them, and I wanted them to save my life. And I had on my feet very nice boots. I had officers' boots. First of all, they asked me to give them my boots, and I have to give them my boots, and then they left me alone, and eventually I went out in the street, but I found out, I realized I saw a group under guard, a Jewish group being taken, walking under guard. They were walking, so I secretly joined the group, and I wound up in Krakow ghetto, and then I was in the, eventually I was sent to Ploshov, Prokocim, Bieżanów, Skarżyska Kamienna, Częstochowa, and Buchenwald. And then during the concentration camp, I was working in Germany for BMW and 60 feet underground, because the American troops were bombing the areas in the concentration camp. I didn't know if I'm living, I don't know what my days were. A Polak almost killed me. He ripped up a big branch. He wrapped over my head when he knocked me down completely. And I didn't realize where I was. At one time, I remember, and I wanted to get killed by the Nazis, guards who were standing. And I went down and I was waving. And then I was waving, they should, with the guns. And no guns went. So I eventually I walked away from the area and I found a garbage can. And a garbage can was a garbage full of potato peel. And I was delighted to see, and I was so happy. And I mostly ate up maybe all the potato peels in the garbage can I ate up. Somehow I existed, but I remember when a Hungarian group of people, maybe 90 or 100, mostly were women, and they were lined up and the line, and this guy's name was Mengele. This German guy's name was Mengele. My mother was put on the right side, and she avoided going to the left. The left side was going to the ovens. And the people didn't realize that they were going to the ovens. They were the only thing you could see outside was the smoke. I was in Bayern, and then I was in the Russian army, was in Bayern over there. I approached a Russian soldier, and somehow he understood, or didn't understand. He took me into a German house, and he told him he was standing with a Kalashnikov rifle, and he told him, wash him up, give him new shoes, give him new clothes, give him everything new. I kept going into Poland, and then in Poland, the Polish people were walking around in the streets and condemning the Jewish people, and they were making us unbearable to live. And I separated myself, and I climbed over the Tatra Mountains from Krakow to Zakopane, from Zakopane over the Tatra Mountains to Praga and Czechoslovakia, and Praga, Czechoslovakia, and I walked up all the way out to the border of Germany, where General Eisenhower was in Frankfurt am Main, and over there somehow I saw my brother sitting, and I just saw him just like you see Andrew. I went with my mother on the American troop ship crossing the Atlantic. It was very shaking, and my mother got sick. It took us 10 days or 8 days to come to New York City. The people who live here now cannot believe the destruction and the pandemonium and the life which we went through. It's nothing what they show on the telly. It's unimaginable. And whatever I say, it's about 100% a lot worse. And can you imagine Germany was one of the the richest, the most democratic country in the world. I'm grateful where I am and why I am and how I am.
I would now like to introduce Rabbi Shalom Axelrod, Rabbi of the Young Israel of Woodmere, to share some inspiring words tonight. Following Rabbi Axelrod, Cantor Joel Kaplan of Congregation Beth Shalom will lead us in Kel Maleh and Ani Mamin. In lieu of our in-person candlelighting ceremony that would ordinarily conclude the program, we invite and encourage you to light a yurtzai candle in your homes in memory of the victims of the Shoah. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. One of the terrible aspects of this pandemic that many of us are not aware of has been its impact on survivors. Both in America and in Israel, well over 1,000 survivors died this past year. It's a tremendous number. And even more suffered from the lockdowns that they went through throughout the world. In Eretz Yisrael, the very first Israeli killed by the virus was Aryeh Evan of Jerusalem, aged 88. He died on March 21st. Aryeh was a Hungarian Jew whose father died in the Mauthausen concentration camp. He survived the Nazis in a cellar with his mother and siblings and emigrated to Israel in 1949. And I think it's important for all of us on this day of Yom HaShoah to reflect and to empathize with what the survivors have gone through in this very, very difficult year. There's a particular thought I want to share with you. It's a Torah Tamima on a line within the Gemara discussing an aspect in terms of Parshas Achremos, where in the context of the service of Yom Kippur, we mention the deaths of Aaron's sons. The Gemara states in the Yerushalmi, L'lamdecha shekashem sheyom HaKippurim mechaper Yisrael kach misasan shel tzadikim mechaperes al Yisrael. That just as the service of Yom Kippur atones for the Jewish people, so too the death of the righteous acts as an atonement on Bnei Yisrael. And the Torah Tamima is bothered. Exactly how does that line up? Just because the deaths of the tzaddikim, should that cause atonement upon the Jewish people? How does that connect to Yom Kippur? And he answers with a thought based on the Pirkei Reb Lazar, detailing how Klal Yisrael responded when Shaul HaMelech died. After Shaul's death, God connected with the Jewish people through the act of mercy upon them. Why? Suggests the Torah Tamima. It's because the Jewish people responded to the death of Shaul by crying, by fasting, and by eulogizing. It was their response that caused the mercy to come upon them. And so says the Torah Tamima, it's not the death itself of the righteous that causes atonement. It's how we respond. When we have the memory of the 6 million kedoshim on Yom HaShoah, how do we go about our day? The need is to reflect and to give honor and to memorialize all those who were killed because they were Jewish, and to inspire future generations to never forget.
Hail, Molei Rachamim, Shoyechevene Bameromim, Hametzei Menuchonechoino, Ale Kanefe Ashechino, V'mahalos kedoshim utehorim, Kezohar horokia mazhirim, Eseni shemos hakedoshim v'atehorim, Shehu mesum v'sheneherigu v'shenishchatu v'shenisrevu v'shenitbiu v'shenechneku al kedusha Hashem al yedei atzorim hagemanim yemach shemom v'zecherom began Eden teimenu chosom lochein balu rachamim yaset yarem beseiser kinofav li'olamim v'yitziror b'tzror hachayim es nishemo yisayim Adonai hu nachalosom Ve'yonuchu b'shalom al mishkevoysehem v'nomar Amen. Ani mamin, ani mamin, ani mamin. Be'emuna shelemo bevias hamoshiach bevias hamoshiach ani mamin v'af al pi שישמעיה עם כל זה אני מאמין